Knives Out is a movie that I used to think was genuinely good, but recently I decided to rewatch it and was surprised by just how many problems I had with it. Even if I were to ignore my issues with the comedy or social commentary, it's a movie that's fundamentally built on contrivance and incredibly stupid characters, more so than almost any other movie I've seen. So in this video, I'm going to be examining most of the issues I noticed in order to explain why I consider Knives Out a deeply contrived film. I'll begin with Harlan's death, which is where the contrived nature of the movie really starts to show itself. My first problem is how quickly Harlan accepts that he's going to die despite him showing no symptoms of a morphine overdose. Marta says that the symptoms should show up in about 5 minutes, and by the time Harlan starts explaining his plan, it's been almost 5 minutes, yet he isn't sweating and seems completely lucid. Harlan also doesn't consider that the blood work would show large amounts of morphine in his system. I don't believe that Harlan would be capable of coming up with this elaborate plan, yet wouldn't consider this fundamental flaw, especially as someone who has made a career of writing murder mysteries. There's also the aspect of Walt not recognizing Marta through the glazed window. I get that Harlan knows his family well, but this step relies on Walt facing away from the window, only turning around for a brief moment, and not trying to start a conversation. It's also weird that Harlan thinks that going along with Walt's commands would make him seem less suspicious, especially since he clearly isn't the type of person to just do what other people tell him. And once Harlan slits his own throat, a drop of his blood lands on Marta's shoe, despite them being on the opposite sides of the room. But if this didn't happen, then Blanc wouldn't have immediately catched on about Marta being involved. This is the first big twist of the movie, and it is very poorly executed. Harlan is both smart enough to come up with this plan, yet dumb enough not to consider its biggest flaw. Walt not recognizing Marta is extremely dependent on convenience, and the blood being able to splatter on Marta's shoe doesn't make sense with how far away she is. We're already off to a pretty bad start, yet the contrivances will only get worse from here on out. The next thing I want to talk about is the investigation of the Thromby estate, as it's where we get a lot of incompetence from the police characters. Up until Blanc intervenes, the police seem certain that Harlan wasn't murdered, but apparently their investigation was solely limited to his room because there's so much easily found evidence that's only uncovered once Blanc gets involved. They didn't even check the security footage before this point, despite that being one of the most obvious things to do, especially if they want to confirm that no one snuck into the house. This is made even more bizarre by the fact that the cops just take the family's testimonies at face value, without doing any further investigation to ensure that their stories line up. This especially doesn't make sense with Linda's testimony, where they don't even investigate the creaky stairs to see if there's any way to walk on them silently. The only reason that Blanc seems remotely intelligent in this movie is because the cops are too stupid to do the most obvious procedures. But anyways, we start to see even more issues once Marta starts sabotaging evidence. I don't know why the security guard has Marta control the VCR player instead of doing it himself, and I don't know why the police are just fine with her handling evidence. Regardless of whether they think Marta is guilty or not, it doesn't make sense to allow anyone who's potentially involved to tamper with evidence. Shortly after Marta sabotages the VCR player, the police decide to take the cassette tape in order to digitize it, but for whatever reason, they briefly let Marta hold on to it, allowing her to damage the tape by rubbing it with a fridge magnet. Even if one of the cops eventually decides to hold on to it, that doesn't change the fact that they're just letting her handle important evidence. This is made even worse during the mud scene, where Marta plays dumb and steps all over her footprints in order to get rid of the evidence. Even if the police and Blanc don't think this is intentional, I don't know why they're keeping Marta around when she's interfering with the investigation, and it just makes all of them look even more incompetent. But then we get a scene that makes Marta look incompetent, where one of the dogs brings her the broken piece of wood from the trellis. While it is pretty convenient that the dog decided to bring her this piece at this exact moment, I take more issue with Marta's choice to throw it, despite the very real possibility that the dog would bring it back. It would have made so much more sense if Marta just hid it under her coat, but instead she makes one of the dumbest decisions possible, which eventually leads to Blanc discovering the fake wall. This scene also makes Blanc seem incompetent, where he's only able to notice the trellis after finding the broken piece, even though it should have been very easy to notice while he was walking around the house. This whole investigation scene is honestly a perfect encapsulation of the movie, where the plot isn't able to progress without its characters being complete morons. But now I'll move on to the scenes with Marta and Ransom, which have many issues of their own. Ransom knows about how Marta vomits whenever she lies, so he tricks her into eating food so he can find out the truth of Harlan's death. But Marta literally has no reason not to just get up and leave. Ransom isn't a cop, and since they're in a public space, he can't really do anything to stop her. But instead, Marta just tells Ransom everything, making for another important piece of plot progression that relies on her stupidity. But shortly after this scene, Marta gets sent the blackmail note that contains the heading of the toxicology report. This means that the report has been finished, yet when we learn that the examiner building burned down, it seems like none of the police are aware of the results. This not only relies on no one reading the report once it's finished, but the examiner keeping zero digital records or camera footage, despite this movie taking place in the late 2010s. Ransom then says that if Marta destroys the copy of the toxicology report, that she'll be completely in the clear. But that doesn't account for the morphine in Harlan's corpse or anybody actually reading the report once it's finished. But anyways, that brings us to the dumbest car chase ever, which I'd personally say lives up to its name. Since the police cars are almost catching up to Marta, she decides to suddenly stop in the middle of the road. This tricks the police cars into going past her and provides a brief delay for her escape. As if the police weren't made incompetent enough, we get to see just how bad they are performing a car chase, where they're completely unprepared for the car they're pursuing to suddenly stop. We then see Marta drive into a narrow alleyway, and one of the police cars hits a building in an attempt to follow her. And I feel like I need to show just how badly this car missed the alleyway. It would be one thing if they started entering and were unable to fit, but instead they miss it and drive straight into a wall. We are honestly reaching cartoonish levels of incompetence in this movie. But anyways, we then see another police car that's right behind Marta, and by complete accident, she's able to knock over a conveniently placed stack of wood, blocking the second car's path. This isn't as blatantly stupid as the car crash, but it's just so convenient that this was able to happen in order to stop the other car. And despite all of the stupid things that allowed for Marta and Ransom to escape, they just end up getting caught anyway. It's one thing to include contrivances in your story in order to progress the plot, but the fact that Marta and Ransom get caught anyway makes these contrivances completely pointless. I'm aware that one of the cops calls this car chase dumb, but that honestly feels like lampshading since the cops have no reason to be this bad at their job. And what makes it even worse is that the police only arrest Ransom but not Marta, despite her being the person who has been driving away from the police. The explanation we get is that the police are only here for Ransom, since Wynette saw him climbing the trellis shortly before Harlan's death, making Ransom one of the main suspects. But if that's the case, then I don't know why they immediately assume Marta's innocence, despite her being the person who was helping Ransom evade the police. The only person to ask if Ransom forced her to do this is Blanc. And after Marta says no, she quickly gets back into the car and vomits into a cup. Not only is it convenient that Blanc asks her this question right before she has the chance to enter the car, but that he won't notice any smell despite sitting in said car for a few minutes. But anyways, Marta asks Blanc if she can stop to pick something up, and he allows this without showing much concern. I think that now would be a good time to talk about one of the reveals at the end of the movie, specifically that Blanc knew about Marta being involved in Harlan's death, yet kept her around anyway. way. If his intent was to find more information from her, then a lot of his actions throughout the movie don't make much sense. He never seems very attentive of what she's doing, and it leads to him losing important pieces of evidence. And in the case of stopping by the laundromat, he literally just lets her go to do whatever she wants. Blanc not paying much attention to Marta already didn't make much sense, but when taking into account the reveal later on, it ends up making even less sense. But anyways, we then see Marta sneak into the laundromat where she's able to see someone slumped over in a chair, and somehow she isn't able to realize that this person is dead/unconscious until she literally gets out a flashlight. But once she does, it's revealed that the blackmailer is Fran. I'm going to discuss this scene with the context of later information because it is genuinely one of the worst parts of the movie. Once Fran wakes up, she's able to tell Marta that she stashed a copy of the toxicology report. She then says, "You did this," followed by "won't get away with it." We learn later on that Fran was actually talking about Ransom, which makes this scene so much worse in hindsight. First, you have the convenience of Ransom having a first name that can be mistaken for the word you. Then you have Fran being the only person who refers to him as Hugh. Then you have Fran deciding to reference Ransom by this specific name rather than the one everyone in the house calls him. And finally, you have her saying, "won't get away with this," but conveniently leaving out the he at the beginning of that sentence. And all of this is so Marta can think that Fran is talking about her. This brief scene is so painfully contrived to prevent Marta from learning the truth, making it extremely frustrating to watch once I had full context. But with that out of the way, I'll now talk about the big reveal scene, which takes the already contrived plot points that Knives Out is built upon and makes them even worse. Blanc goes on a long speech to explain how Ransom is responsible for Harlan's death, and he starts by revealing that Harlan told Ransom about how everything he owns is going to Marta instead of the Thrombies. Since we're on the topic of Harlan's will, I think it's worth mentioning that the movie doesn't really explain why he considers his family members unworthy. It only really makes sense with Joni, who is intentionally stealing money from Harlan, but we get no indication of any similar frustrations towards Linda or Walt. Harlan's decision is basically what causes the entire plot of the movie, yet it isn't given a proper explanation. But anyways, we learn that Ransom swapped the contents of the morphine and Toradol bottles to trick Marta into injecting Harlan with a lethal amount of morphine, meaning that when Marta accidentally switched the bottles, she was actually giving Harlan the correct dosage. We then get an explanation for how Marta instinctively knew that the liquids were swapped. That instead of reading labels before injecting someone with drugs, she instead recognizes them by their slight differences in color and viscosity due to her using them so many times in the past. This is extremely irresponsible on Marta's part, yet Blanc still frames her as being a good nurse, saying that she knew what she was doing and gave Harlan the correct medication. But I fail to understand how not reading labels properly is an aspect of a good nurse. Shortly after learning about Harlan's death, Ransom sneaks into the house while his family is at the funeral in order to tamper with the medicine bag. But conveniently, he doesn't make sure that no one else is in the house, giving Fran the opportunity to spy on him. And even though the police have investigated Harlan's room at this point, they just left the medicine bag there despite it being potential evidence. Doesn't really make sense that they would do that, but if they didn't, then Ransom wouldn't have had the chance to tamper with it. This is also how we learn that Fran's blackmail note was for Ransom instead of Marta. Blanc questions how Fran got a copy of the toxicology report, and Marta reminds him that Fran's cousin works at the examiner's office, which is insanely convenient considering that this is the only way Fran could blackmail Ransom. Fran also chooses the worst possible place to meet Ransom, a dark enclosed space where she wouldn't be able to call for help. giving Ransom the perfect opportunity to kill her. We then see Ransom inject Fran with a lethal amount of morphine, which creates a pretty big plot hole in the film's internal logic. Ransom is with Marta about 30 minutes before she finds Fran, and Fran was injected sometime before that, meaning that it has been much longer than 10 minutes, yet Fran is still alive once Marta finds her. The only explanation I can think of is that Ransom didn't extract enough morphine from the vial, but I can think of no reason why he would slack off on something like that. So I find it more likely that Rian Johnson just forgot about the rules he set up. We also learned that it was Ransom who burned down the Examiner building, believing that it would destroy any evidence besides Fran's copy of the report. But once again, that doesn't account for the morphine that's still in Harlan's body or anybody actually reading the report once it was finished. But anyways, Marta receives a call from the hospital and tells everyone in the room that Fran is still alive, which leads to what might be the dumbest part of the movie, where Ransom says, "Yeah, I killed Fran, but I guess I didn't, so what do you have on me?"
It's so dumb.
It's so dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb.
It is beyond idiotic for Ransom to admit that he killed Fran, even if he thinks that she's still alive and that the lawyers can lessen his sentence. There's no way in which he benefits from this, and we're given no indication that he would ever do something this stupid, especially when he came up with this elaborate plan in order to get Harlan's money. This is yet another character decision that exists to progress the plot rather than actually being a decision that character would make. Ransom also threatens to ruin Marta's life while the police are still in the room, adding yet another layer to his inexplicable stupidity. But if all of that wasn't enough, we then see Marta vomit on Ransom's face, revealing that she was actually lying about Fran being alive. The time it takes for Marta to vomit is significantly longer than any other time she's lied. The lies about Richard's infidelity and Ransom forcing her to drive only took about a few seconds. The lie about Harlan seeming normal took a few seconds longer, but the fact that she's rushing to the bathroom makes it safe to assume that she's already starting to throw up. But when she lies about Fran being alive, she's able to hold it in and maintain composure for over a minute. It is beyond contrived that Marta suddenly has the ability to hold it in for this long, especially since it's the only reason that Ransom decides to confess. But once Ransom realizes that his life is ruined, he grabs a knife from Harlan's display and attacks Marta with it. But once the two of them are on the floor, they eventually realize that the knife he grabbed was a fake. What I want to know is why it takes the police so long to grab Ransom. Even if they thought for a moment that the knife was real, you'd think that they'd want to prevent Marta from getting stabbed more than once. But even if they immediately realize that the knife was a fake, Ransom is still capable of doing physical harm. Blanc also should have been able to anticipate something like this happening. He realizes that Ransom is the murderer right before his speech, yet he doesn't warn the cops beforehand so they can prevent him from causing harm. Even if Marta doesn't end up dying, the fact that Ransom even got the chance to stab her makes no sense whatsoever. Back when I first watched Knives Out, this reveal scene was my favorite part of the movie, but now that I'm rewatching it, I genuinely think it might be the worst. It adds even more layers to the contrived nature of the plot and relies on everyone in the room acting like a complete moron. It takes what was already a pretty bad movie and somehow manages to make it even worse. Hopefully you now understand why I consider Knives Out to be very poorly written. Contrivances and stupid characters aren't the only issue I have with the movie, but they are a fundamental part of how the plot functions, so I think that alone prevents it from being good. But anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say about Knives Out. This was a bit of a quicker video than a lot of my recent projects, but I hope that you enjoyed it regardless. If you think that there was anything I missed or got wrong about the movie, then feel free to let me know. But anyways, that's about it. Thanks for watching.